So last week we spoke about the concept of knowing, knowledge. And so last week we spoke about the concept. So understanding the difference between where does knowledge end and where does faith begin? We discussed at length that the idea of knowledge is faith. Faith has to begin where knowledge ends. If we know something, then to use the term believe is really shortchanging oneself. In other words, intellectually, if I can know something, then why believe in it? What is knowledge? Knowledge is a sense of assuredness about something. The Alter Rebbe uses the term hargasha, that you feel it in your body. And we have the example of the fact that I'm alive, right? I don't have to intellectualize the fact that I'm alive. I know it. I don't have to believe that I'm alive. I know it. It doesn't need any explanation. And because each of us have a soul, and the soul knows God because it experiences God in a real way. So when we see something, that's knowing. The fact that we don't necessarily consciously know God is because there's a concealment. God's presence in the world is concealed, but our soul knows God, and therefore we inherently know God, and we don't have to intellectualize it. We see it. What we need to do is work through the peeling away of the layers so that we can see it in a conscious way, which is the journey of life. So on page 6, the Alter Rebbe tells us that there are two commandments, the commandment of knowledge and the commandment of faith. And he tells us that what the world typically calls faith is not really faith, it's really knowledge. For the above mentioned reason that we inherently see godliness, so therefore we know godliness. You don't believe in something that you know. And continuing on page 7, he says that we see this. The verse says, "For my flesh I see God." The human is the microcosm. That just as we look at our body, we then are able to reflect on the divine experience. And since our bodies, we know that we're alive. We don't have to be convinced of that. So therefore, we also know inherently that God is. As the verse says, lift your eyes heavenward, lift your eyes upwards and see who created these. The idea means that we see with our soul. So let's pick up at the bottom of page 7. This knowledge is experienced by the person as if they see. This is why the verse says, "For my flesh I see God, I perceive God." Therefore, this is not called belief, but rather it's called knowledge. Because the idea of knowledge is recognition and awareness, feeling. Knowledge is also when you're not thinking about the particular thing that you have knowledge, you're still constantly connected to it. And that's inherently the idea of knowing God, is that even when we're not thinking about God, if we just choose to tap into what is inherent within us, we're immediately back in that space where we know God. Whereas if one only superficially thinks about it, that's not substantive. That doesn't really impact us. Okay, chapter 2. We're on page 10. This knowledge, this awareness, this feeling of God is experienced in the level of memale kolam. So we discussed this at length in many different discourses, that there is the dimension of God as he fills the worlds, and there's the dimension of God as he encompasses the world. God, as he fills the world, is where every creation receives a very specific divine energy, tailor-made for that form of creation, and that purpose, the purpose of that particular entity's existence, so that a human gets a different energy than an animal, and a stone gets a different energy than a carrot, and so on and so forth. So that's Mimale Kalam, and that's God as he fills the world. And then there's God as he encompasses the world. So when we talk about knowing God, where can we know God? We can know God in the space that we have a relationship with. What do we have a relation? What dimension of God do we have a relationship with? We have a relationship with God as he fills the world, as he takes us individually into consideration, as opposed to how God takes all of creation collectively into consideration. As we say in the daily prayers, that God, in his essence, transcends all of existence. And since God in his essence transcends all of existence, everything is like nothing before him. God is as he was before creation, as he is after creation. So that dimension of God, we can't have a personal relationship with. We can have a relationship with, but it's not a personal relationship, to the point that we can say we see. God creates every creation, as we mentioned, and he makes every creation, he sustains every creation according to its need and its purpose. We are a creation. Even the soul is a creation. So we exist in that space of creation. And we can have a relationship with something that is relative to who we are. Something that is in a different dimension, we can have a relationship with. It's like saying you can't hold a pencil with your brain, right? You can't. The brain is it's made up of different matter. Its function is different. It's the realm of thought. It's not the realm of action. So the brain can relate to things that are in its dimension. The action cannot relate to the thought. It's a different dimension. So within God's manifestation, there are two dimensions. There's God as he is in his essence, which transcends all of creation, and he's unaffected by creation. And then we have God as he creates and takes creation into consideration and sustains each element of creation. And in that dimension of God, that's where we can have a relationship. So it begs the question, if God is transcendent and he is the same as he was before creation, as he is after creation, to borrow from the previous discourse that we learned, that if God is in the realm of thought, so how indeed does a physical world come into being, or even a spiritual world? In other words, how does a God who transcends any kind of definition or boundaries How does a God like that create a finite world? Spiritually finite or physical finite? Just to confuse you a little bit. If you have something that's infinite, if you were to pull a piece of that infiniteness out of the infinite, are you holding something finite or something infinite? Think about it a second. If you're holding something finite, then you're not really holding, then the infinite is not really infinite. Right? If I can pull, to confuse you even more, 1 penny and 1,000,000,000,000 pennies are relative to each other. But 1 penny and infinite pennies have no relationship. But that's confusing because infinite pennies would not be the pennies that make up this infiniteness, would not be pennies as we know it. Because by definition, if I can hold it, it's finite. So if God is infinite, how does a finite world come into being?
It's a kind of a momentary. There's the proposition in physics that if you define something, you change it. So as soon as you hold that penny in your hand, it's a penny for a second, but it's no longer what it was.
Which then is a commentary on the infiniteness of what it was. And if God is infinite, but we can make him finite, then is he really infinite?
No, I think there are 2 things. That means 2 things can exist at the same time. You're just pulling it out momentarily so that you can grasp for that. Thing, an aspect of it.
So you're actually saying something that's very interesting. It's I think it's Rabbi Chaim Vital that says this, a great Kabbalist. He says that if you say that God has only capacity in the infinite, but he doesn't have capacity in the finite, then you're limiting God. But the Alter Rebbe gives a different answer. His answer is that God remains infinite, and the finiteness that we're talking about here is only in our perception. Now, what does it mean it's only in our perception? It doesn't mean that it's an optical illusion. It means that God allows for us to exist in our own consciousness, even if that very existence is really inherently subsumed within God's infiniteness. In other words, what I'm looking at here is a finite vessel, a finite cup. But what is this cup really made out of? What energizes it? What holds it together? It's divine energy, and that divine energy is infinite. So the fact that I see it as a cup is because I perceive it that way. But if I were able to perceive beyond the filtered layer, what would I see? I would see the Word of God. I would see the infiniteness in it. There's a beautiful discourse that I recently studied that says that, how do I know that it's not an optical illusion? So this is from the Rebbe Marash, the 4th Rebbe. He says that the only way I really know that it's not an optical illusion is because the Torah says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Full stop. Because the Torah tells us that God created a world, and you can't say that the Torah's comment about God creating a world is an optical illusion, because then there's no right and wrong. And he analyzes it very fascinating. He says I mentioned this, I think, some point in the prior discourse, that there's a Mishnah that says that 2 people collect cucumbers through magic. And one of them, the Torah prohibits the use of magic, sorcery. And it says that one person is punished and one person isn't. Why? And what's the punishment for sorcery? It's stoning. So he said, why is one person punished and one person not? Because one person's a David Copperfield, and the other person is actually using sorcery. In other words, one uses sleight of hand so that it appears that they're collecting cucumbers. And even though we actually don't, there is a prohibition around optical, creating sleight of hand and so on, but for a different reason. But you're not accessing the power of sorcery. The other person uses sorcery, so therefore he's liable, which is interesting, a conversation unto itself. The power of sorcery, this power we see is something that's real, not kosher, not holy, but real. There is an impure force in the world that one has the ability to access to be able to perform sorcery, which is why the Torah prohibits it. If it was just a sleight of hand, there would be nothing wrong with it. You don't get punished for a sleight of hand. You don't get stoned for sleight of hand. But because the person that's performing this act is actually accessing the forces of sorcery, the forces of impurity, which the Torah prohibits, so therefore there's a consequence. So the Rebbe there in that discourse says that if the whole thing is an optical illusion, then both of them should either be liable or neither of them should be liable. And if it's an optical illusion, so then the stoning is not real either. You just stoned somebody, but you didn't really stone him, right? So clearly there's something real going on here. But what's the realness of what's going on? The realness of what's going on is in our perception. Not that it's not real, but it's real in our perception. But if we peel the layers back, what we see is the divine energy that's there. And we can go into the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, that, as we discussed a few discourses back, that what they perceived in the garden was the word of God. That's what they saw. They saw the actual divine energy that sustained the garden. Where was that garden? That garden was this physical reality. But they saw not the garden, but they saw the word of God in the garden. That's what they saw. Is that somebody at the door? I'll buzz her in. I got her. Right? They saw the word of God, which opens up a can of worms. What's the sin and so on, but we'll leave that alone for now. All that to say that the infinite God, who's unchanged by creation, the fact that we perceive a creation is a result of God allowing for us to have a self-perception of something other than God. Now, even that begs the question, how does that happen? How does an infinite God create a space where there's a consciousness of the finite? So that's what he's addressing here on page 11. He says, "Rak b'chinas malchuscha levada hi malchus kol ha'olamim." There's a passage in Psalms that says, "Malchuscha malchus kol ha'olamim." Your kingdom is the kingdom of all worlds. So the Alter Rebbe unpacks this verse to say that the attribute of God's kingdom or God's kingship is the source of all physical, even spiritual, finite matter. To explain, the Hainu, that is, it is a shine and a ray of God's kingship that creates space for independent consciousness. Like it says, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Leilam Vad, Shem Kavod Malchus Kavod Malchus Atzma. It is the name of God's kingdom, but not God's kingdom itself. So let's explain what this means. When you live in a town in the royal kingdom, and the king puts forth an edict, and you never saw the king, you never saw the palace, you never saw the throne room, what motivates you to follow the king's orders? And again, we don't have really great examples of this because we don't have the royal kingdoms anymore. But we can imagine that the person who lived in the countryside that heard the royal edict followed the edict without question. What influences that individual to follow the edict? It's the ray, it's the shine, it's the aura, it's the influence of the king's kingship. If you're in front of the king, so the king himself, the awe and the fear of the king compels you to do what you need to do. But when you are not in the presence of the king, it's the aura, it's the influence, it's perhaps we use the word the energy of the king that influences those in other places to follow the edicts of the king. The light itself is unchanged. It's the influence of the light that trickles down and creates space for there to be a consciousness that is able to operate within the notion of the light, but not in the luminary itself. Because you're not in the brightness of the sun itself, or you're not in the brightness of the light itself. So therefore, there's a consciousness that's separated from that light. And in that place of that consciousness, we can think of ourselves as something separate. But it's just our perception. And it's intentional. God created this perception so that we can operate in that space and be able to have free choice, which is the whole purpose of creation, is to make choices between good and evil, to choose. Is this landing? You walk into the lecture hall. I'll give you another example of this. Sometimes you hear a really profound lecture, and in the moment, it's overwhelming. But when you move away from that lecture, over the coming days and weeks, some of those ideas suddenly crystallize for you. Because in the space of the light, you're lost. You're subsumed in the energy of what's being put forth. But when you separate yourself from there, when there's distance, then there's an I, there's a me that can now process that and digest it. In the presence of God's light, there can't be an I. There's only the infinite. But in a sense, because the consciousness of creation comes into being through the shine of God's light, through a ray of God's light, in that space where, so to speak, the light is concealed, now we can have a perception. And that's what creation is, by the way. Creation is creating a distance in consciousness between the source and the manifestation. Also in various different mystical texts, it talks about the difference between what's known as Ila and Alul, cause and effect, and creation, Yesh Me'ayin, ex nihilo. If the creation that comes about as a result of cause and effect, where each level is born from the prior level, you'll never have an independent consciousness, which is where God introduces this other mechanism of Yesh Me'ayin, something from nothing, where there's a complete stop, there's a complete separation in consciousness. We exist in a place that's post-creation ex nihilo, Yesh Me'ayin, something from nothing. So in our in that state of post-creation ex nihilo, we see ourselves as something separate from the source. And in that space, we can begin to have the ability to make choice between right and wrong. This makes sense? You'll have to create some separation and then digest it. Let's go further. Hopefully it'll continue to crystallize. Regarding this, our sages say, until God created the world, He and His name, all there was He and His name. That even God's name, which we said is the attribute of God's kingship, which is the aura that trickles down, even that was one with God. Like the verse says, for his name is exalted, it stands alone, it is for him alone, and it is only a ray and a shine of God's name that is upon the heavens and the earth. In other words, it's not just that it's God's name, but it's a shine of God's name. Prior to creation, everything was subsumed. Even this thing that was going to be called God's name, right? We call God by a name, which immediately tells us that we're talking about a manifestation of God. Because once you're putting a name on something, you're giving a definition, you're giving a description. Even if we're just saying God's name, that means it's not God himself. That dimension that was destined to become God's name was one subsumed in God himself. Then when God created the world, he created this ability for this name of God to be separated. And when it's separated, now it has a ray and a shine of it that then manifests itself, that then becomes the source for independent consciousness. It's like the sun, right? The sun, what color is the first light of the sun? All you scientists.
Like an orange.
If you look up at the sun, what color do you see? Outside of the orange ball, what's immediately on the outside of it?
Orange.
Guys, it's a good thing you guys haven't looked at the sun lately. It's black. The light immediately next to the sun is black. Why? Because it's subsumed in the sun. It doesn't have an independent light. But as soon as you move away from that, now you have the rays of the sun. And of course, by the time the sun reaches Earth, it's already something we can deal with, can experience, even though there's going to be a heat wave this week across the country. Yes.
Maybe misunderstanding. This is a question in the realm of terminology. The God that precedes and is outside anything to do with creation, the prior God, for lack of a better word, do we still use the word king for that? Is that king term to me implies something outside the kingship?
Great question.
It seems like there should be another name for that aspect of God that's preceding.
So we in Hasidic terminology, we have one word for that. And it's not very descriptive. It's called atzmos, which means essence. It actually is not a name. It's just I don't even know what you call it, placeholder. It's God's essence as it is, without any descriptors whatsoever. What's crazy about it is that God's essence is right here. In other words, it's in the space of it's in the space of our consciousness. In the space of our consciousness is where God's essence is. But we can only experience God's essence through the ray of God's light that allows for us to be, for God's essence to be filtered, at least in our own consciousness. So that when we look at the cup, we see a cup. But when we contemplate it, we realize the cup could never come into being just from a ray of God's light. The cup can only come into being from God's essence. Light doesn't create. Essence creates. God himself creates. What God allows for us in the process of creation is to perceive creation as something separate. That's a result of the light, the ray of the light. But you're correct. God's kingdom is already a descriptor.
Does the discourse use kingship with regard to the God outside of creation?
No. No.
So once we use the word kingship, we're already got the concept in creation.
Where are we talking about God's kingship? We're talking about God's kingship, which is equal to God's name, right? Like the verse says, for he and his name are alone, or before creation, it was only God and his name. There wasn't a name for God then. This thing that was destined to become kingship was subsumed within God. It's like an idea a desire that you have before you even know you have that desire. Where is that desire? It lives in your essence. But once the desire comes into a state of consciousness, you know, oh, I had that desire in my essence. That's why I have it in my conscious state. But when it was in your essence, you didn't know of it because it was subsumed in your essence. That's the black hole. That's the black rim of the sun. Because it's not independent of it. It's subsumed in the source.
But it's gotta be, the essence has gotta be something that's not, because otherwise, once you define kingship, its definition, therefore it's got a box around it.
Correct. And by the way, the analogy of the sun is not a good analogy either, right? Because the sun is a physical object, and we are looking at the sun, we're saying, oh, that's the essence of the sun, and that's the name of the sun, that's the black hole, the black rim, that's going to become, before creation, there was no black rim either. There was only God. We're in a post-creation world, we're using the term that says that before creation, he and his name were one. That thing that was eventually going to become God's name was one with him. It didn't have any independent identity. It's like the desire that lives in your essence before it becomes manifest. It doesn't actually have any entity in your essence. It's just there. It's part of your essence.
There's a lot of mental gymnastics.
Yeah. So what we're saying is that we can have a relationship with God's manifestation, but not with God's essence in that way. Let's see what he says on page 13. V'nikra hu yizbarach, God himself is called Soviv Kolamim, that he encompasses all of existence. She'ein ha'olamais teifsim makim negdoi, that the worlds don't take up any space by him. Or as he translates here, the worlds have no significance compared to him. Shechayusay hamispashe teicha olamais eina kedimyan hanashama mislabeshes mamish teicha guf umispaelis mimikra guf umimikra azmakim hamakim vazman karvachaim. The life force that Hashem invests in the world is not like the soul, which actually lives inside the body and is affected by the body. Place and time, weather, cold weather, hot weather, the soul is affected by that because the soul lives inside of us. Hashem is not affected by creation. He's not defined by that. Before God himself, regarding God, even though God exists below like he does above, God is not defined by any space whatsoever, and that which is above and that which is below are equal to him. So when we say, again, furthering the mental gymnastics, right? When we say that God encompasses the world, we immediately think of a circle. Because this is the language we have, right? We think of a circle that here's existence, and there's this dimension of God that fills this existence, and then there is the dimension of God that encircles the existence. That's not what it means. We're just, for the poverty of language, we have no other choice but to use this terminology. But what is the idea of something that encompasses something? It means that everything that it encompasses is equal before it. There's no top, there's no bottom. So there's a dimension of God, the name, the kingship of God, the ray of God's light, the ray of God's name, all of these terminologies. Baruch Shem Kivod Malchusay, like we say in the second verse of the Shema, blessed is the name of God's glory, of his kingdom. These are all descriptors that are talking about how God manifests himself. That's the dimension of God that fills existence. But God himself is unaffected by creation. He is before creation. He is after creation as he is before creation. He encompasses all of it, meaning none of it affects him. There's no top, there's no bottom, there's no high, there's no low. It's all one total entity. I gave the analogy in the past of Albert Einstein walking down the block. and beneath the earth, there's an ant farm. It's insignificant to him. It's there, but it's insignificant. It doesn't affect him whatsoever. It's a poor analogy because all of that is in the finite. God creates a spiritual and physical universe, and he's unaffected by it. It's so insignificant. And in a sense, it almost comes into being in a passive way through God's light, because it never really came into being. It came into being in our consciousness. Again, not to overplay that, it came into being in our consciousness because God wanted it to come into our being in our consciousness, which makes everything so relevant. This is not a happenstance. It didn't just happen. God chose to create, to allow that in this place that we call creation, we have a consciousness of self so that we can fulfill our purpose. But God himself is unaffected by the creation, because God himself is beyond creation. He transcends all of that. I know this is a hard concept.
So I get to the point where what's our purpose? What was God's purpose of putting us here? So to know and to understand him, so that we can fulfill our purpose in living in this finite world. Part of that is understanding or trying to understand our relationship with the divine.
That's why we're studying this. No, I mean that seriously. This is the purpose of creation. Now, it's not intended to stay in this room. In other words, I don't mean that like Fred usually says, it's not a secret, but I'm saying it's not intended to stay in this room, but it's when we study and contemplate what we study that we become more connected with that truth, so that when we are at work or we're eating dinner or we're in a relationship that we're navigating, or whatever it is that we encounter in life, we don't see this as something separate from God, but we see that God is present in that experience. And the more we understand how it is that God is present in that experience, it makes the experience a divine one. You know, we live in a world today where there's so much anxiety, people are so unsettled. And if you look at what's going on in the world, it's understandable why it's unsettled. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, it can get dark very quickly. And there are a lot of people that navigate that darkness, that potential darkness, through all kinds of other means, positive thinking and so on. So, I mean, there are all kinds of tactics. But I have to tell you that the best way to navigate that darkness, the uncertainty, is through faith. I don't mean faith like I believe in God, but to know God. We'll get to the faith part later, but to invest in this, right? Because when you see stuff going on and you pause for a moment and you say, wait, this is not happening in a vacuum, because God is here as he was before creation. So if all this stuff is going on and it's all designed for me to fulfill my purpose, okay, so what's my purpose? How am I supposed to process what I'm experiencing? Part of a master plan, which then begs the question, what am I supposed to do in this master? What's the action that I'm supposed to take? Which now becomes a question of right or wrong, or even within right, what would God want for me to do in this situation?
Right, it's whatever it is, not fun, whatever, but then you tell yourself, okay, this is from God. And the second question is, well, what am I really supposed to do with this? What is this? And how do you get to what is this? That's what you're trying to take it from.
Yeah, well, so
I mean, it's easy to say, it's easy to have faith, right?
we want to connect with
It's
it.
easy. Faith you can have. The question is, okay, this happened, okay, I believe totally there's good in this. But, you know, you gotta know what to do with this to really, to make it manifest itself forward, right? That's part B.
Yeah.
That's why I guess in my mind, I was having that.
100%. And it's not a one and done. That's the other thing. Because we're finite, we are always going to be in the cycle. We're always going to be in the cycle of trying to, we're not going to be in a perpetual state of divine consciousness. We can have moments of that, which reaffirm for the moments that we're not in that consciousness, that we're connected and we're not living in a jungle, that there's a master to this story. I'll deviate for a minute. Something that I've been working on and thinking about. There's a big movement today. There's a lot of language around being present, right? A lot of the language of I don't want to cheapen it by saying self-help or psychology, but there's in the energy of our young universe is people focus on how do I get present? How do I get present? How do I get present? What does it mean to get present? Getting present is the ability, the willingness to let go of the discomfort that I have with not knowing. And the way to let go of the discomfort that I have of not knowing is by believing that God is present. And when I can do that, then I can take action from a place of strength. Let me unpack that. Somebody says to you, let's say your wife, maybe. Somebody says to you, you know, why did you do this? Why did you do that? And immediately, again, to use today's language, you get triggered. Right? You get triggered. What are you getting triggered about? So you say, oh, like, why are you accusing me falsely? Like, what's wrong? Why is that such a trigger for you? Why does somebody trigger you? Why does somebody else trigger you? Their presence, the way they talk, something that they did to you. They trigger you because there's two things. You see them as having power, and you see them as exposing something about you that you're carrying shame around. Right? If we go back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, we read the story that as soon as they sinned, they suddenly had shame. What's the shame? The shame is I did something wrong. When somebody says you have this and that fault, we carry shame around that. Why do we carry shame around that? And when we have shame, it's a very uncomfortable place to be. So what do? We try to escape the shame. Right? We escape the shame by getting defensive, by blaming others, by engaging in unhealthy behavior, right? But that's what it is. Does this piece make sense? We have shame, right? And when we get triggered, our shame is exposed. And we don't like the way that feels. It doesn't feel good to have shame. It's a terrible feeling. It's terribly uncomfortable. So we react because we want to push away that uncomfortable feeling. And we engage in all kinds of unhealthy responses or behaviors to alleviate the shame. How do we alleviate the shame? How should we alleviate the shame? So we're using this language, be present with the discomfort. Right? So somebody accuses you of something, and suddenly you feel this terrible shame inside and you want to react. By the way, you don't even necessarily process that it's shame. You just feel like a need to react. But now you're moving in slow motion. So you have time to process, right? That's part of the job, is to learn how to slow down our nervous system so we can actually analyze what's going on. Okay, so but the real key to slow response is to be willing to be present with the discomfort. And you say, why should I be present with the discomfort? It doesn't feel good. When you dig into that discomfort, what do you find? You find God. Because why do you have, what's the experience that you're carrying shame around? On a most basic level, so much shame that we carry comes from our genetic wiring or our parental upbringing or the culture that we grew up in. Somebody told us that, this is not the way to behave. Sit straight. Finish your plate. There was a video going around last week, a great video of a kid sitting in an apartment building in Israel that had just, sustained a missile attack. And the room is in shatters. The walls are caving in. The bed's upside down. There's dirt and dust everywhere. And the kid's sitting there. I don't remember if he's looking at his phone or something. And the father comes in. He starts screaming at him in Hebrew. He says, quickly, clean up your room. How long is it going to take you to clean up your room? So what's this art imitates life? It's like, that's the way we treat people. It's the way we treat our kids. Clean up your room. Like, what's wrong with you that you're sitting here in this? It's a joke, but it's not a joke because that's the way, like what happened to, hey, but that's, let's clean up the room. It's nice to be clean. I took a walk with one of my daughters yesterday and I let her talk. And the conversation, when you let a kid talk, they share everything with you. And the key is to not shut down that conversation. Because if you start getting critical, then they immediately retreat. So I was letting her talk, but there was something that she brought up that I wanted to give her guidance on. But instead of telling her, because I have a little bit of experience, instead of telling her, not that I've done it always right, instead of telling her what was wrong with her approach, I asked her, how does that make you feel? Do you like that feeling? Like, let her figure it out. I'm just gonna feed the information. Because if I tell her what's wrong, then it's shame. Even if I don't intend to shame her, that's how it's processed. And now in the brain wiring, there's this thing that if this thing carries shame. Now she may decide to do that thing anyway, but there's always going to be shame around it. And that's how each of us are made up. By the way, we even have shame about things that we did that no one told us are wrong. There's religious shame. There's cultural shame. There's behavioral shame. There's so much shame. But if we believe that God is present, then that's exactly what God wants from us. It's perfectly designed. So when somebody says to you, why did you do this and this? And you get triggered, you stop for a second, you say, yeah, I got some flaws. God put them into me. Okay, so now that I acknowledge that, I don't have to have shame around it. In other words, by being willing to be with the discomfort of the shame, you find God.
The thing, I'm still to apologize, but I'm saying analogy that the mom comes and messes up the apartment, and then the father goes to the son, who had nothing to do with it, and basically reprimands the son to clean up the room. So that son, he's supposed to, and it triggers something in him, like, hey, why are you blaming me? I didn't do this. You call that shame? I mean, that's the part that I'm struggling with.
Yeah. So again, let's just. By the way, even in a humorous situation, sometimes that also can activate shame, because what the father basically subtly is telling the child that this is something to laugh at, because in another situation it might actually be serious, right? Having your apartment bombed out, like, I don't actually really expect you to clean up your room. But if it wasn't a bombed out building and I walked in here and your room was a mess, so again, I'm not blaming the father. You gotta make light of situations. But what is the child experiencing? The child is experiencing that a messy room is not right. And that is put on the child instead of the child learning it. When we learn things on our own, we don't carry shame around it. which is such an important thing because God doesn't force us to learn. God gives us the ability to make our own choices, to figure things out for ourselves. And we have to do that with our children, our little children and our adult children, and people that we're responsible for in the workplace. You got to let people figure things out for themselves. It doesn't mean you don't give guidance, but it's how you give the guidance. It's how you empower people. That changes whether they experience something as shame or they experience it as their own, the nature of human beings in this aforementioned self-consciousness. We want to be independent. I want to figure it out by myself. So if I figure it out by myself, if I discover that keeping a messy room means that I can't find my shoes and I'm going to miss the bus and they're not going to put me on the team, next time around, I'm going to do a better job of keeping my room clean. I don't have any shame around that. I've learned an important lesson of life, right? If my mother walks into the room and says, "Your room is such a mess, this is disgusting," what do I learn? I learn that there's something wrong with a dirty room, with a messy room, and there must be something wrong with me that I can't keep my room clean. Now I have shame around the messy room. So for the rest of my life, until I process this, I walk into an environment that I'm responsible for, and I say, "Oh my gosh, look at this place. It's such a mess. What I'm such a loser." Right. So yeah, go ahead.
Here by design, does that mean that it's appropriate to feel shame because God has put shame on earth to make us do the right thing? Or does that mean we shouldn't feel shame because, we have to embrace our flaws, so there's no need to shame.
The feeling, there's nothing wrong with the feeling. The question is, what do you do with the feeling? Right? We have such a tendency to want to escape discomfort. But there's a in the space of addiction, they say that the addiction is not what do they say? The addiction is not in the way, the addiction is the way, right? The challenge is not in the way, it is the way. The uncomfortable feeling is not something to run away from. It's in the uncomfortable feeling that you find the answer. And every time you run away from the uncomfortable feeling, you're just exacerbating the problem. And if you can find a way to be in the discomfort, you start healing.
So you saying that analogy, it was a lesson for the child to learn something that he didn't have before.
You're saying it with the...
It's an analogy with the mom kid that did nothing. So you're saying there was some level that child needed that experience.
Yes. From a divine providence standpoint, right? If I was that child and I had the wherewithal, I'd ask myself, what's the messaging in this experience? But that's true for us in every experience. And the main point I'm trying to make is that it's actually which goes back to your question, is like, what do we do with all this, right? The answer is that we find God in the experience, because God is in the experience. God is the experience. And then we can move from that to doing something productive around it in terms of our purpose on this earth. But every time we run away from the trigger, we're avoiding the very path to fulfilling our purpose. So this is, so this is the story. This is the story where God creates in a way where, in a sense, God's essence is transcendent, and we don't have a consciousness of that dimension of God. And yet God is fully present. God's essence is fully present in everything in our life experience. And that when we can lean into that, we can then access the presence of God and then begin to move from there or through there By the way, you can't do this with an agenda. In other words, you can't lean into the discomfort so that I can get out of the discomfort, because then you're not really present. You have to lean into the discomfort because that's where God is.
You're saying instead of responding back to the person, just try to stay quiet, realize there's something in there from God. They're gonna come to you, but don't respond to this is so direct back to the.
Right, right. So whenever you're outputting, you're not looking inwards, right? By the way, it's good advice in general. In other words, when one is angry, at my last daughter that got married, we had a Friday night dinner, and her new aunt spoke, and she said, you know, people always give at these gatherings, people give marriage advice. She says, I'm going to give you marriage advice. Everybody says you should never go to sleep at night angry at your spouse. She says, I disagree. You should go to sleep angry. She says, why? She says, what happens? You have this principle that you can't go to sleep angry at your spouse. So what do? You got to work it out. So you spend an hour and a half fighting with each other until you resolve the fight, and then you go to sleep. So go to sleep. In the morning, it won't be an issue. It won't be an issue. Sometimes, and especially with this understanding, is the trigger has nothing to do, that person's not at fault, the circumstance not at fault, something to do inside of me. And if I'm going to engage in output, what I'm doing is I'm avoiding looking inward. Right? So what ends up happening is you shoot your mouth off, and then you have shame for shooting your mouth off. Right? And then and the whole energy of what could have been an internal learning moment becomes about the fight that ensued externally, and you actually never take the time to look at yourself other than to figure out how you're going to put your tail between your leg and apologize and move on from there. Instead of saying, I'll respond tomorrow. This was a great line we learned, my wife and I, maybe 10, 15 years ago, one of these marriage educators. He said, there's a great line to use. I'm going to reflect on that. I don't have to disagree with you. I'm going to reflect on that. You know how many fights that stops? I'm going to reflect on that, because there's a tendency to want to disagree, right? Especially if you disagree, especially if it's ego-based, right? But I'm not going to, I want to extrapolate myself from the situation, but I don't want to completely humble myself right now. My ego's too triggered right now. So the answer is, I'm going to reflect on that. Now, do I reflect on it? Probably not. Do I ever get back to her on the subject matter? No. But the issue has been resolved because I didn't let the ego completely, trigger. So the point is that if we can be present in the discomfort, because we know that God is in the story, and you don't even necessarily have to fully figure out what God's plan is. I mean, we're not that we're capable of that anyway. But even if I just pause and say, I know God is in the story. I know God is here. And I'm going to be present with God in this discomfort.
Yeah.
Whatever needs to come to you will come to you.
Yeah, the count of 10, right? It got a chance to calm down and
Yeah.
maybe reflect.
What I'm saying to that point is that there's tactical, which is the counting to the 10. The tactical is save your comeback till tomorrow, right? That's all tactical. I'm going to step deeper. That's a good start, because if you can start with the tactical, then at least you open up the possibility that you can actually be reflective. But then you got to be reflective. You got to dig into the discomfort.
How about somebody says something out loud in the workplace that's not true? And the fact that, and then it can be detrimental if you don't address it on the spot. That's just a different dimension. Like, you can still, because many times I've seen, even myself, like whatever, somebody will say something that can be detrimental in the workplace or a spouse or a friend that's actually, it's not true. You can say that you didn't do that, that wasn't your intention, blah, blah, blah.
So why does it trigger you so much?
I mean, what are you supposed to do?
I'm asking you, why does that person's statement trigger you so much? So what? Why do you have shame around it? What?
It's not shame, because other people can interpret.
Who cares? Who cares? If you're walking down the block and a homeless fellow who you've never saw before, you'll never see again, says, you look funny. You know it's not true. Why are you going to get triggered from that? I hope not. I mean, some people do. But are you going to get triggered from that? You're not. I hope not. Because like, who cares? I'll never see you again. Your comments are nuts. I don't have to get excited about it. Like, I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying that if somebody says something publicly that there's no place to respond. I'm asking you to think about why did I get triggered from that?
Somebody comes up and says, Rabbi Shushkin stole $10 off the table, I saw him do it. You're not supposed to say anything? You're supposed to say,
I'm asking a question. Why would I get triggered from that?
you have a right to say this is not true.
I have a right, but why do I need, what's my need? What's my need to defend myself? Why do I need a reputation? Why is my reputation important to me? I don't either know right now, but I'm saying is there's a reason. And by the way, and if you can figure out the reason, if you're going to respond, it's going to be a healthy response. It's not that there's no place to respond. All I'm challenging you is to think about, we have these, I think I mentioned this maybe a month or two ago. It was getting close to Shabbos, and my wife was getting ready to light the Shabbos candles. And I see that the Shabbat table wasn't fully set. And I got a little hot under the collar. And my kids are, it's their Friday job is to set the table. I said, why isn't the table set? We're about to light the candles. So my wife turns to me and says, what's going to be so terrible if the table's not set? In other words, what's going on for you that you have like this rigidity that the table needs to be set? And I don't know what it is. Maybe I saw it at home. Maybe my father, was impatient. Maybe my wife was impatient at one point. I don't know, whatever. But for whatever reason, I got triggered. Is it a big deal that the table's not set? No, it's not a big deal at all. Like, but if I paused when I started getting hot under the collar and said, whoa, what's going on here for me? Like, why is this such a big deal for me? Then I may have come away from that calmly and said, it's really nice when Shabbat starts that the whole house is set. It does say in the Code of Jewish Law, the table should be set and so on. But it would be coming from a calm place. And I would have said to my kids, hey, it would really be nice that when Shabbat starts, when the Shabbat queen enters in, that the table's set and it's beautiful. That would not have been a shaming statement. But so what's going on for me? Again, there's this need to defend myself. What am I defending? Why is my reputation important to me? Why is it important? I'm not saying reputations aren't important. The Mishnah says that the crown of a good name is greater than all of them. But is that what's bothering me? Why is my reputation important? So whatever it is that's triggering me, if I pause and I say, what's going on for me? Where is God in this story? And the way to eliminate the shame is to realize that whatever the spark is that I have a discomfort around is by divine design. By the way, even things that I did as a child, even bad choices I made yesterday, they're also by divine design. So I need to pause and reflect and say, okay, that wasn't right what I did yesterday, but if I'm going to stay in the shame, I'm not going to change that behavior. And then we become trapped by it.
It's like a development skill to be able to pause from reaction, or not to react first, be able to do something purposeful with your response. So it's kind of like developing muscle and skill set. I had an incident at work with one of my supervisors the other day that, said something that I knew was not true. I wanted to jump back, but I held my power. And it's been eating me for like a couple of days now about how I should respond, whether I should respond. And I finally realized that the proper thing for me to do was to let it play out, not really respond, but to not go there. And then she eventually calmed down and started to address the problem. That she had an agenda underneath it all, and it allowed that to be revealed. But the old me would have just made it a lot more aggressive.
Right, and
a lot of it would have been very.
And that period of time waiting for that to happen is very uncomfortable, right? But every time you hold back, you're calming your ego down. And if you incorporate some of what we studied today to say, okay, I see God is at play here. Let me see how it plays out. Right? Again, sometimes that you need to take action, but stepping back and letting God do his part.
In other words, you see a child is told to do something totally wrong, how they gonna know to correct that? But you say something, it's not, you can say something, it's how you say it, right?
Yes, yes.
You still go through the process, okay, what's this, what does this teach me? You're still allowed to say, hey, that's just not, how you have to correct them with behavior, like the child, it's the other child, you can't just, it's fine. Just sit there, don't say anything, so keep it, you can't do it.
So again, the question one needs to ask themselves is, why is that child's behavior getting to me? Why is it getting under my skin? Because if it's getting under your skin, in other words, if you're coming from a place, hey, I've got a responsibility to educate this child. Okay, what's the best way to educate the child? If that's the conversation you're having, okay, that's really healthy. But if you're, and by the way, all parents suffer with this. There's a certain amount of triggering that goes on. And it has nothing to do with the child's behavior. It's something inside of us, which is why our responses to the child are not healthy. And we carry the banner of, it's my responsibility to educate my child. That's why I'm doing this, when that's not really what's going on for you. It's not that you don't have that responsibility, but that's not what's at play here. What's at play here is your trigger. And if you can be in the discomfort, then you can come back and address it. There's a rabbi, Manis Friedman. He's a Chabad rabbi. He's a big educator. He's very well known. Instagram and YouTube and all this nonsense. Anyway, so I remember something he said years ago. He said, the best way to discipline a child is not to discipline them in the moment. Your child does something wrong. I'm not saying if there's a fight, you got to stop the fight, right? But don't give them a lecture right now. Come back to them the next day. As the child's getting into bed, you lay down with the child and you say to them, hey, by the way, yesterday when you said such and such to your brother, I want to tell you there's nicer language, blah, blah, blah. However you do that. So just the fact that you waited to the next day tells the child that their action was noticed, that it wasn't insignificant, that there's something important about that behavior needing to be in a different way. So just to the point of pausing, right? The pause itself. Why is that true for the child? Because the child knows inherently that your response is a triggered response. They know that from how you react. And it's hard. We all have dents and bruises that make up our shame, and we're going to react from that way. If we can pause, we can work through that, and the next day when we come to the child, it's a different conversation. All right, to be continued. As I mentioned, next week there's no class.